Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.
Images are not always pictures, but they can often be a picture. Like, for instance, to me, images from the musical world are images that nobody has seen with the real eye other than the people who were there. If you talk, for instance, about the Carter family crossing the Holston River when they were going to Bristol in 1927, and it was incredibly hot, and they had to fix the flat tire a couple times, and they had a baby with them. And that is something that's as alive to me as seeing you on this screen or as putting my hand on a guitar or something. You know, that's the fascinating thing about American music, that it's so young. You can put your hand on it, that's still warm wherever you go. And that's how I want to write songs these days, you know, based on these things that are very alive to me, even if they're not real in the visual world.
Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. This week my interview is with Thomm Jutz. Tom's been on the podcast before. If you've been listening for a while, you might remember he came on to chat about a beautiful album called Nothing But Green Willow that he put out with Martin Simpson, which was a collection of songs that had been collected by Cecil Sharp in the Appalachians 100 years ago, and a variety of artists, including people like Sierra Earl and Tim O'Brien. A beautiful album, and that was a fantastic conversation. And I'm delighted that he's back, and we're talking about another wonderful album. It's called Ring-a-Bellin. It's Tom's new album, but it also comes with a companion hardback book. You can just get the record, but you can get the book as well, which sort of includes the lyrics, some writing about each song, some beautiful kind of images, some beautiful pictures, and the whole package is fascinating. Works as a record. It's a wonderful record. I've been really enjoying it. But it also kind of details Tom's process, and I love talking about people's music. But I also love talking about how people approach making music or art of any kind. And so this was a fascinating conversation for me, just digging deep into it. We talk about kind of the genesis of this project, how Tom put it together, kind of how he uses the analogy of kind of alchemy to talk about songwriting and sort of breaking that down and how that applies to some of the different songs and his approach. And it was just a really kind of deep, beautiful conversation. Really, really enjoyed this one. I hope you get something out of it too. Links in the show notes to go and check out where you can get the record and also where you can get the book that goes with it. And I'll stick a link in the show notes to the episode that I did with Tom and Martin Simpson as well, because that is worth a listen if you haven't heard it. Yeah, great chat. Really enjoyed this one. Usual stuff applies. If you want more info on Bluegrass Jamalong to find other episodes like the one with Tom and Martin, go to bluegrassjamalong.com. There are also dozens and dozens of Jamalong tracks with me playing guitar for you to practice fiddle tunes too. There's tracks where I play the lead so you can practice backup. There's tracks where I play backup so you can practice lead. And there's tracks where I swap over so you can practice jamming. And they're all there if you want them. You can play along, you can change the speed, the record charts, all of that. What else? That is it really. If you've enjoyed this episode, or indeed any episode of Bluegrass Jamalong, please do share it with your friends. You can support Bluegrass Jamalong. There's a link in the show notes. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts for a tiny amount of money every month. But what I really want is for people just to share it with other people who love bluegrass as much as they do. So if you have enjoyed this one, grab a link, send it to a friend, and I would be very, very grateful. But that is it. Here is my chat with Thomm Jutz, all about his wonderful album, Ring-a-Bellin. Tom, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. It's great to see you again.
Thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
I'm really looking forward to this one. It's such a fascinating project, and there are so many kind of ways to look at it. And I wonder, just before we kind of dig into it, if you could give people a quick explanation of what this is, because it is an album, but it's also much more than that, isn't it?
Well, it's an album that comes with a companion book, a 40-page book. That's sort of it's a hardcover coffee table book with a lot of original artwork by people who I really like, whose artwork I like, and it's essays that relate to every song and the lyrics to every song. And it's an 18-song record, so it's pretty long because apparently I can't get enough of myself. And It's a record that is not an autobiographical record, but it is a record about the development of me as an artist, if you will, from growing up in the Black Forest of Germany till I moved to Nashville and what I did here over the last 25 years or so. And it's a record about a certain view of the world, and you're looking at the world through images and symbols and stuff like that. So a lot of topics from analytical psychology and alchemy flow into that, because those are things that I'm interested in when I'm not interested in guitars or songwriting, which I always am, but every once in a while I want to read something else. And so it's a little bit of that, and the songs are not, okay, here are concepts of analytical psychology. It's all just images that are important to me, that some from childhood, some from a couple of years ago, and it's songs about that. So it's a little tricky to explain, and it's also not mandatory to listen to the whole record back to every song back to back. You can just pick out the songs, and I think every song speaks for itself as well, and can stand on its own.
Well, that's the beautiful thing. I think you can take each song and listen to it. Works fine. You can listen to it as a record without knowing any of what you've just said, and it's a record, and it's a beautiful record. It's beautifully recorded. It's got great songs on it. All of that, and you can start to dig in, and that holds up as well. And what I love doing a podcast, somebody sends me their new record and they send me kind of a little line or two about each track, so I can start to get a sense of. And this is kind of like gold for me, because there's so much in there, so many levels to dive in on. But yeah, and I think it's really important to point out to people that this is, like, if you want it to be, it's just a record, and it's a great record, but you don't need to know the rest of it.
That's right.
Did it start out as that, or did the collection of songs come together and suggest a format? Which sort of way around did it go?
Well, I started recording probably in February last year, and I didn't have a plan. I didn't plan to make a record. I was just wanting to experiment with a very, very small units of musicians. And I especially wanted to record a couple of things with my friend and wonderful bass player, Mark Fain, who a lot of people in the bluegrass world know. And I just wanted to see what we could do with upright bass and guitar and vocals. And the result was really interesting to me, especially improvising over chord progressions when you just hear the bass and you don't have somebody holding down the chords, and trying to play solos that still make sense to the listener and don't feel self-involved in a way. That was really interesting to me. And once I figured out that I enjoyed doing that, I looked at my catalog, which is a pretty expansive catalog, and the 17 songs that I chose and then added another 18th one to it sort of presented themselves to me in a way that I would describe as synchronistic almost. Like it was like, oh, this one relates to this one, and this one relates to that one, and this one relates to this one. And at that point in time, and still today and for the last probably 10 years, I was really interested in, like I said, Jungian psychology, analytical psychology, and symbolism overall, and mythology and things like that. And so all these songs kind of presented themselves, and it was just a matter of juggling them around and going like, oh wow, these songs, there's an arc to these songs, but that arc of songs is also paralleled in my life, and that's how the songs presented themselves. But then I also wanted to not make a record that was just me and an upright bass player. So I added musicians to it, but only as much as needed, it always has to be like a 5-piece band or any rules like that. Some stuff is just me and a bass player and Tim O'Brien playing bouzouki or clawhammer. Some stuff is just me playing and singing. Some stuff is just me and a piano. Some stuff has Tammy Rogers on fiddle and a piano and an upright bass. So, and I wanted to record live as much as possible. So all the vocals are live, for better or worse, because I'm not a great singer. So there's, it's sort of definitely a warts and all approach. All the guitar parts are live. The only overdubs are maybe one or two guitar solos here and there, a couple of piano solos, because the piano is such an immobile instrument. You have to sort of build everything around it if you don't want to haul it around all the time. And and a couple of harmony vocals where I couldn't get the people in the room at the time. But what you hear is very live, and that's something that I really wanted to do on this record, and that's something that I'm going to cultivate going forward. I have absolutely nothing against layering tracks for records if you have to do that, if the music warrants that. I have nothing against recording to a click track if the music needs that and warrants that. I do a lot of music for TV and film, and it's just a must in that world, but also for other records. But for my own music, I got a little, not tired or anything. I just wanted to experiment with different ways of making music, more free ways of making music. Timing it's totally fine if timing moves. It just has to move organically and in a good way, and maybe a lot of modern bluegrass music has gotten away from that a little too much for my taste, and it got very militaristic in terms of how strict it has to be in the sense of timing, how hard it has to be tuned for people to feel like it's the correct level of perfection. And I just didn't want to mess with that anymore. And it's also not a bluegrass record. I mean, anything that I ever do will always have bluegrass influences, but that doesn't always mean that it's a hard driving bluegrass record. This is more a record with a lot of, I would say, old-timey references, There's a lot of bluesy kind of stuff in it. There's probably a certain amount of me being a big Tom Waits fan in that as well. So that's sort of how I approached it. And I also recorded with a lot of ribbon mics, which makes for a completely different approach. And I'm a big fan of AA ribbon mics and work together with them sometimes. And that stuff those microphones bring so much character to the session that it makes everything sound a certain way from the beginning. Takes it out of the very bright modern world and immediately puts it into a different world. You can make stuff sound real 1930s, 1940s with those microphones, and it still sounds modern at the same time.
Yeah, well, it's funny that sort of Tom Waits reference, because it has that intimacy that I kind of always hear when I listen to his first album, Closing Time. And this record has it's a late night album. Like the dark closes in, you put your headphones on. It's a beautiful album for shutting the world out to. And it sort of sucks you into this lovely little performance space that, with very few musicians in it, you sort of feel like you're in the middle of it.
Well, it's interesting that you say that it's a good album to shut the world out. That's probably something that I unconsciously wanted to do. And, there's a lot of dark stuff going on in America at the time that I don't want to have anything to do with. And maybe that's a reaction to that, and it's another way of describing what a lot of these songs are about, which is bringing the inner and the outer together. And maybe that happens, on that record. Maybe that's what I try to do for myself. And hopefully that translates to the listener, and it can do something similar to the listener. If anything, I think this record is all about the importance of looking at images. Images are not always pictures, but they can often be a picture. Like, for instance, to me, images from the musical world are images that nobody has seen with the real eye other than the people who were there. If you talk, for instance, about the Carter family crossing the Holston River when they were going to Bristol in 1927, and it was incredibly hot, and they had to fix the flat tire a couple times, and they had a baby with them, and that is something that's as alive to me as seeing you on this screen, or as putting my hand on a guitar or something. That's the fascinating thing about American music, that it's so young. You can put your hand on it, that's still warm wherever you go, Or, for instance, Jimmy Rogers taking a rest in the recording studio in Camden, New Jersey, before he recorded The Last Blue Yodel, which is the last song that he ever recorded, because he was TB stricken. That's not documented visually, but to me it's alive. And so many other images like that. And that's how I want to write songs these days, based on these things that are very alive to me, even if they're not real in the visual world.
And it's interesting, sort of, that thing about shutting the world out, because one of the kind of themes that recurs through not only the songs on this record, but the way you write about the songs on this record, is that kind of dance between the inner and the outer world. And, you know, you shut the world out and you go inwards, and you often learn something you take back into the outside world. And when you go out and be with people and be in the world, you bring something back that you unpack for yourself. And there's a line in there about kind of themes of home and time, which are both just kind of ways of boxing off spaces, either you know, within time or within space. And it is, we have this infinite kind of world of stuff, and so we create spaces to put things in. And it's very easy as human beings to presume that our now is the infinite ultimate now, and for practically everybody else, my now is either the past or the future. Right. And like there's only me experiencing it as any kind of now whatsoever, but I'm in it. And so I love some of these themes, kind of playing with that and playing with our idea of time and space and how stuff is layered and it's all there all the time.
Yeah, I think that, you know, home and time are the two main themes that we write about, you know, and if you want to conceptualize that, you could say they're the two main archetypes that we write about, and that brings you right back to analytical psychology and Jung. That is where archetypes are so important, you know. But I think home and time are the big things, because everything else can be subcategorized under those two things. You know, love has something to do with home, and it has something to do with time, and all the other things that we like to write about. And home has something to do with place, which is also a real interesting concept for me, because place is not just a geographical location. It's also what you bring to the place, what humans bring to a place, what music you bring to a place, what music you draw out of a place. Transportation in the United States, such a huge historical topic, you know, and like take the train, and then the train becomes its own symbol. You know, the road becomes a symbol that Bruce Springsteen has written about his entire career. And the train is something that Norman Blake has written about his entire career, you know. So these archetypal American, or these archetypal images that are distinctly American, are things that are really fascinating to me. And when you write a song, you bring the inner and the outer together, you know, like you see something in the outer world, you experience something in the lived world, and you process it and turn it into a song. And that's why alchemy is such a fascinating historical concept, you know, because those pre-scientists, they were going like, well, let's see what happens here. What happens when I burn this down and combine it with that, and then it coagulates with this, and then I see a red dragon in the smoke that I just created, or whatever. And the interesting thing is that they didn't know what they were doing. So they had no language to describe what it was. They had no chemical language, but they were doing the experiments. So they had to use their imagination and imagery and poetry to describe what was going on. And that's what we're doing when we're writing a song. The exact same thing. You distill something down, ideas, these stay out, these come in, add something to it, add craft, add spirit, imagination, and you have a song.
It's really interesting you use the word process there, because, again, so many of these songs are to do with, like, process and how life is in the constant doing and the moving and the forward motion and it kind of reminded me that we use process in two very different ways these days. Like in many ways, art is a process, like the products are just what come out of the process, but being creative is a process. But we also use process in kind of a computing way to mean having worked through something.
Yes.
And there's something you write in here about, it's this idea that no business is ever finished, and like we don't ever really process anything. We just work through it to the extent we can and get on with our lives. And that kind of, so there's dual themes of that one word, like run through everything on this record.
Yeah. I mean, nothing is ever finished business, you know. We fool ourselves into thinking that we resolved one issue and that's going to take care of it for the rest of time, but it just doesn't. It crops up again and again. Although if it were different, we wouldn't have all the problems that we have in the world today. You know, if we were smart enough, we wouldn't to know that going to war doesn't work, then we probably wouldn't go to war. Or if we were smart enough to look at what happened in the United States 8 years ago, we wouldn't vote for the same guy again. And I'm sure you experienced some things like that in Europe as well, you know. Not to be too political about that, but that's one manifestation of where we know how a certain process works. or doesn't, and then repeat the same mistakes.
Well, and it works on a very personal level. You can take the political out of it, and just as a human being, I'm constantly relearning lessons that I've learned. I'm going, what are you
Sure.
doing? You know this. You've learned this. Like, why are you doing this again? But it's like, it's the way we operate.
Yeah, absolutely. I heard something really interesting the other day, that when we switch from perceiving everything as I to talking to ourselves, we can work through things much better because we're much better at giving advice than we are at taking advice. So that's actually been measured by scientists, that when you switch that narrative from, for instance, saying, "Oh my God, I'm so anxious," to saying, "Yeah, I know that you're anxious right now, but you've done this before." It switches to different perception all of a sudden. So all this weird kind of stuff is on this record. And what's interesting to me too is to see if I can take musical forms that are representative maybe of American music of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, and combine them with those ideas and see if something cohesive comes out. Again, you have the inner and the outer. You have opposites that you try to keep in balance. It's fascinating and it's fun, and it keeps you from writing the same thing over and over.
And there's a lovely theme of that on the song Rag and Bone, about kind of not only repurposing things, but also not giving up on things, like not just giving up on something because it's a little bit broken. And there's a lovely line you got in the book. It says, "I work in a remote corner of the music business, collecting bits and pieces from a long time ago. I put them together with leftover memories and dreams and make something new out of them."
That's what I do.
And that's a lovely, because we are conditioned in some ways to think of creative people as being constantly pulling new things out of the air. And this idea of creation as a recombining of things that exist is a really beautiful idea, I think.
Totally. I'm really influenced. I'm very influenced by the poet and painter William Blake, who is a Londoner, and how he perceived the world and how he perceived his work in the world to constantly create, whether anybody cared or not. To him, the highest form of humanity was to imagine, to do, to create. And he did it penniless his entire life, and was content with that. Now he's considered one of the greatest poets and painters of all time, English painters of all, and poets of all time. And ironically, we have Norman Blake, same last name, who does something very similar, or did something very similar, very insular in his existence, other than touring, as William Blake, except for a couple of years, never left London. Norman Blake only left Rising Fawn, Georgia, when he had to go on the road. And now he's back there. He's not going anywhere. And my life was completely different. I've uprooted myself from where I was born to move somewhere where I knew there was purpose and meaning, which to me is Nashville or the greater American Southeast, where the music that sort of drives my gears comes from. But at the same time, I admire how Blake always stayed in that one place and was so heavily focused on recreating the music of the past, but bringing something new to it. I've studied Norman Blake pretty intensely when I did my graduate thesis got a graduate degree a couple of years ago. And my thesis is on the sense of place in Norman Blake's songwriting. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about Blake and thinking about his oeuvre of, songs. And especially I wanted to approach him from a songwriting perspective, because so many people have only approached him from a guitar player's perspective, which is understandable because it's so great. But you leave a lot on the table if you don't look at the writing. So it's funny how those two come together. I wrote a song this morning with my friend Charlie Steffel, and we wrote a song called Blake and Blake. That's about William Blake and about Norman Blake.
We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collins Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new hill country instruments on the Collins Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collinsguitars.com. Well, it's really interesting because it ties in with the thing you were saying earlier about home being a place, but also about what you bring to a place. And you mentioned kind of moving from Germany to come to the States, and there's something in the kind of the book about that around the song "Too Many Walls" and this idea of knowing quite early on that you didn't belong where you were and needed to be somewhere else.
Yeah. I did, and it's not that I'm always I always want to be clear about that. It's not so much because there was something wrong with the specific place that I grew up in, or my parental home, or that house, but I just didn't feel like I belonged there, and that has a lot to do, has a lot to do with cultural and identity, and in my case, that is expressed through music. And because of the absurd way that the Third Reich had misused any kind of folklore in Germany, I grew up in a country that didn't have any folk music, that it could sing or wanted to sing anymore, understandably. And I was always fascinated by cultures or societies that have that. But like when I was 18 years old, the first trip that I took with my then girlfriend, now wife, was to Ireland, because I knew there's folk music in Ireland, and it's the closest place that I can get to. Of course, there would have been folk music in Spain, but that was not something that I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear the music that was the precursor or closest relative of American music that I could get to. And I found that in Ireland, and I tremendously fell in love with it. More so the fact that music was a living part of certain people's lives there. Then I'm not an aficionado of Irish folk music. I appreciate it and love it, but I don't know as much about it as I know about American music. And that drove the desire to move here, because I knew that in Appalachia, music was still a part of life, and the continuation of Appalachian music is country music, and so Nashville was the perfect place for that. And that was purely driven by instinct. You could say it was driven by listening to the music, but my listening to the music and deepening my knowledge of the music and affection for it was always just driven by instinct, or intuition, and that's also a big theme on this record, and it's a big theme in Jungian thought or analytical psychology. Analytical psychology, because it's you're a thinking type or an intuitive type or a sensate type or a feeling type, and I'm clearly somebody who's always just followed my intuition, and it's never misled me. I mean, it led me to places that I didn't necessarily care to go to, but that was always good for something else, or it was a learning experience, and I still live like that, and I want to explore music like that. And I think that's what I'm doing on this record. It's just going like, okay, what's interesting to me now? It's the same with the Martin Simpson record that you and I had talked about. It's like, let's do that. There's this fascination. Now there's an opportunity to do it. Let's do it. If I don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. Plus it's fun. I can't think of anything that's more fun than writing songs, playing guitar, and making records. So, we live in it's a frustrating world in terms of the music business, because everything is we're getting so flooded with music. We've created a level playing field where everybody can make music and everybody can release music, and that's great. Everybody should be allowed to, of course, to make music. I'm not sure that everybody needs to release music. And, in decades past, we had the record labels as gatekeepers, and now that's kind of gone. And I'm not sure that we're better off for it. Like if you go to a soccer game, you can't go like, hey, let me play for a minute. I think I could do it. So yeah. There's no answer to that. It's just something we live with, and it's good and bad. Like it allows me, for instance, to just almost compulsively make music and release music, which I couldn't have done 10 years ago. On the other hand, I'm competing with a lot of people who I don't think necessarily need to be using up that space. And now we're also competing with AI. We're competing with stuff like Suno, which is completely unethical in my view, and a completely unnatural way of making music, recording music, writing music is something that I'm philosophically completely opposed to, especially as somebody with a presence in the bluegrass world. A good number of people send me songs because they think I could do something for them, which I really can't. But I'm always happy to listen to songs because I know that for people who don't do this professionally, it provides a certain amount of joy when somebody who is making a living doing this takes the time to listen and says, this is good, or this what I would do better. But now these people are sending me their songs, and they create the demos in Suno. And I have to say, look, I don't want to listen to that. Send me something that's just you and your guitar, and I'll listen. But is there anything more unnatural than listening to a Suno-generated recording of something with mandolin, dobro, and fiddle? I mean, it's just insane. The fascination of this music is that it's wood against strings, that there's this simplicity. That's why you and I are so fascinated with it, because it's like, dude, this thing is so simple and so archaic. You take a string and string it over a resonating body, and there you go. That's the basis of it, That's why we're so fascinated with it. How can anybody get this beautiful music out of a fiddle, out of a guitar, out of these strangely archaic instruments still in their own way? And now we're recreating that with AI. That makes absolutely no sense to me.
Well, it sort of ties in with what we were talking about earlier about process, doesn't it? Like, a song is the output of a process. Like, the final song is the output of you sitting down every day and going, what's on my mind? Like, how do I feel? How do I express a bit of what it is to be me through the medium of a song? Whereas what you're talking about in some ways, and particularly when people actually use now to write things, and the process is everything.
Yes.
But actually the product is all you get. You don't. Yes. The process isn't real because it's not done by people. It's it's literally processed.
It's eliminating the process, and if you eliminate the process, you eliminate the joy. You eliminate the triumph of having mastered a new chord or a new lick or this or that. You eliminate the sadness, if you want to call it that, of not being able to play like Tony Rice, which is something that we all live with. But if you eliminate that, you kill it. If the process is eliminated, the whole thing is not alive anymore. It's just tragic that that's something that's clogging up our souls now, in the music space.
And kind of on the sort of theme of process and songwriting, I was really interested because this record, every song on it is a co-write. Mm-hmm. And you're kind of talking about using this idea of alchemy as a kind of analogy for creativity. I'm curious as to whether you talked through that process with your co-writers and whether they were kind of aware of that, or whether that was even necessary. Like, if that's just your internal organization of that.
No, I didn't talk to them about it. The only person that I talked to Alchemy about, who's a co-writer on this record, is Adam Wright, because we wrote a song called The Alchemist's Way. And so we talked about certain things about that. No, I mean, you don't have to talk about it. It would be unnatural to talk about it because you're doing it. Or whether you're calling it that or not calling it that, or somebody perceives it as that versus me perceiving it as that, it really doesn't matter. In a way, it's more interesting not to talk about it. You just do it. I mean, every song on this record was written with people who I really, really love as people, as songwriters. We already know that we're doing what we're doing. We already know that we're combining ideas, we're combining personalities, musical ways of looking at the world, musical ways of expressing yourself. So it's a direct analogy to the alchemy thing.
And that particular song, kind of looking at the idea of alchemy as an image for creativity. Would you talk us through, for people who are going to hear this before they get a chance to see the book, or people who might not see the book, just can you talk us through the stages of alchemy and songwriting that you identify in the book? Because I find it really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with, if you look at it as a representation of color, it starts with black, with darkness, with chaos. And that's also where you start when you write songs. There's the chaos of the world, the chaos of ideas in your head, and then you melt that down. It's like taking, I don't know, a stone or something, and you just, or a piece of metal, and you melt it down and see, like, okay, what do we have now? Do we have some kind of powder? And then you add something to it. You add fire to it. You add spirit to it, and the last stage is, something glowing red, like the sun comes out of it. So that's sort of quick way of describing it, maybe.
And through this, it's interesting because as a kind of collection of songs, they talk about this arc that you've gone through, but it's very much not a finished story, because it's almost a reflection on how you've got to where you've got to. And did you sort of, going through that process of like reflecting on that, did that story emerge from the kind of the search for something in this, or did you kind of understand that story? I'm fascinated by this because I'm also fascinated by the way people write fiction. Like, some people know the arc of a story. Some people create some characters and see what happens when they put them in strange situations. And I wondered sort of whether you had an arc of the record kind of come to shape, or whether it kind of assembled itself in that sense.
I think it certainly wasn't a planned record. It's not I don't know if it's a concept record or not, but I didn't set out to go like, okay, let's write these kind of songs. As I said, it was rather synchronistic. I mean, these are 18 songs out of, I don't know how big my catalog is, 1,500 songs or whatever. I have no idea. It doesn't matter. But those were the ones that jumped out. Those are the ones that hold the most meaning for me at this point. That's not saying that the other songs are not meaningful to me, but these relate to each other. These tell a story when you put them together. It was rather difficult to find the last song for this record because, as you say, it's an unfinished story. It's a story that goes on. But I managed to write one with my friend Donovan Maccabee that sort of describes where I'm at right now in my life, and it's just called "Settle Me Down." And it's also, I made this record when I was 55, and if you look at these those two fives, if you look at those as like goalposts, it's almost like you can imagine yourself walking through those into a new period of your life. And I feel that way, like I don't feel old, but I'm also not young. There you have it again, opposites. I'm an acoustic musician, and I'm somebody who's deeply interested in the history of American music, and I want to see what I can add to that. That might be, especially what can I add to the canon of American folk music by combining new ideas and old ideas. And so it's fascinating, and it's fun, and it's fulfilling, and it's all I care to do, So, I mean, I teach at a university here in Nashville at Belmont University in the songwriting program, and that's very fulfilling too, to see these young songwriters come up and try to instill a sense of, craft, first of all, but also love of the craft. What does it do to you as a human being when you express yourself in song? Why should you do it, especially in a world that doesn't seem to value that often? How do you manage your expectations in terms of success? How do you deal with the fact that out of 500 students, not all of them are going to find publishing deals or label deals, but still find beauty in it. So it's a good thing to dedicate your life to, I think, writing songs and making music and playing an instrument. It's not something that, has much of a place in the cultural mainstream, but it's almost like a silent form of protest to me, or a way of pointing out I don't belong in the mainstream, which I don't, but I also don't find the mainstream interesting. So I don't have any sour grapes about it. I don't want to be Kid Rock. I don't care. I don't want to make that kind of music. So that takes a long time to learn that and to be comfortable with that, But that's, I think, where I'm at right now.
And there's elements of that in the themes of this as well, kind of, the song You Can Walk, and you talk about walking as a remedy and a meditation and one step at a time, and this idea of kind of just putting your head down and doing the work. And there's something lovely. There's a British writer called Oliver Burkeman who wrote a lovely book called 4,000 Weeks about essentially how to accept that we are all mortal and what we're going to do while we're here. And I had him on the podcast because his book is not about music at all, let alone about bluegrass. But I sort of felt like some of his ideas would be interesting to people kind of grappling with a creative life and how to find meaning in it and he told this story that had come from a Scandinavian kind of artist and writer, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he said basically the idea is just to pick your bus and stay on the bus. He said, he used this metaphor of the Helsinki bus system, where at first all the buses go down the same road and then they start to diverge a bit, but you're not getting very far. So the interesting work is way out of town and you just got to stay on the bus. And you're looking at the other buses going, that one looks more interesting. And you're looking at the other buses like queues in a supermarket going, that one's moving quicker, but you just stay on the bus. And that's your job, is just stay on the bus until you get somewhere interesting. And I found that a really beautiful image.
Absolutely. I'm going to buy that book. I just wrote it down. I wrote this song with Mike Compton, who's lived his life like that. Your listeners probably all know who he is. And if they don't know who he is, they certainly have heard him because he's all over Oh Brother Where Art Thou and plays the intro and Man of Constant Sorrow and all that. Incredible mandolin player. And somebody who's who early on understood what he wanted to do in the world of bluegrass music, really studied Monroe in and out, but also, and he's from Mississippi, also grew up with strong blues influences. And I wouldn't even say he's not an old-time musician, but there's elements of that. He was part of the Nashville Bluegrass Band, which is still one of my all-time favorite bluegrass bands. And his dedication to the mandolin and to that music and to those older styles is so inspiring to me. And it informs his entire life, informs the instruments he plays. It informs the way he presents himself in the world. It informs the way he talks. And he's a really good writer, too. It's really fun writing with him. And I just worked with him this weekend for 2 days on working on a different recording project. And I'm so inspired by how he stayed on that bus, and I just can't get enough of his playing, his tone, the way he thinks about music. It's endless. And it's wonderful to see when people do that, I think. And it's wonderful to see that in new artists as well. If you take Billy Strings, for instance, he found his thing and he's going to stay on that bus. I can guarantee you that.
Well, there's an interesting kind of, there's an interesting thing in this record about that kind of idea of, because there is obviously, you talk about musicians and buses, and there's another side to staying on the bus. And there's a great song called Ramblin' Gamblin' Blues about, and this is, maybe wasn't the intent, but what it did to me most was suggest this image of what we think of when we think of musicians kind of on the bus, traveling around, having a great time. And this idea that what we sell ourselves as good times are not always necessarily good times when you look back on them.
Totally.
They're
Yeah, I wrote that song with Tammy Rogers of the Steel Drivers, and it was based around this guitar lick, or guitar motif, if you want to call it that. And we would just, I don't even know if there was no intention to write something that could be viewed from two different opposing viewpoints. We just wanted to tell a very simple story that used a lot of American images of a steamboat, of a gambler, of a deck of cards, of the Mississippi, of St. Louis, of Memphis. Such wonderful words even, like every word conjures an image. But then when the song was done and I was looking for songs for this record, I went we're writing a song about a guy in probably like around 1898 who gets on a steamboat and wants to go from Mississippi to St. Louis. And in order to do so, he plays cards and he sits around and drinks and there's probably music going on. That's exactly what I did in my own life, only I did it 100 years later in Germany and, got in a van and played thousands of gigs with the trio and thought that was the pinnacle of a life, like the climax of an artistic life, to hack out gig after gig and trying to play like Eric Clapton. And you do that for a while and you learn a lot. You learn a lot about playing like Eric Clapton, and you learn a lot about, and, being on the road with people who don't always like each other after a long time. You understand that, maybe that's not the best way to express your creativity, to constantly just hack out gigs. There's something missing. And that's what happened to me, and that's why, again, this is a song about archetypes. This is a song about the guy who goes on the road to find something. That's literally what I did. And sometimes you go on the road and find something that you don't want to find, and then you have to go on a different road.
Yeah, it's really interesting with this idea of home and kind of that idea of traveling to find something, and it all kind of, just as we talk, I'm really interested in this idea of images in your head, because the way you talk about music from the 20s and the 30s, and it's still warm and it's still real and it's still with us, and there's a lovely theme of that runs through the song Stirring Up the Ghosts, about kind of every inch of land you walk over there's something under there. Wherever you go, there are memories and history and whatever. Yeah. But I was really interested in the idea of, like, what, because you must have, leaving Germany to come to the States, you must have had all these images and these words and these pictures in your head. And I was really curious as to how the America you arrived in kind of lined up with that.
Well, it really does line up with it, for example, like very early on, when I was maybe 15 or something like that, I bought my first Doc Watson record, but I didn't know who Doc Watson was. I was just fascinated by the photo of Merle and Doc on the cover. It was an album called Down South. And then, of course, the music just overwhelmed me, It's the first time I heard flat picking acoustic guitar. And it's a distinctly Appalachian image on that cover of Merle and Doc sitting on the porch of this country store. And those images are totally alive in Appalachia. If you drive through, East Tennessee, Western North Carolina, Southwestern Virginia, you just get off the main roads and you see that. It's so lovely to know that that's still there. Now, does that line up with what's going on culturally, otherwise, or politically in America? No, probably not. But maybe that's the beauty of that image, that it holds something old, that it gives, if you want to see that, you can find it in that image. And I always thought that, not having been born here gives me the opportunity to look at certain images, not in a deeper way, but maybe in a different way, because it's more meaningful to me to drive by an old barn than to the person who's been driving by that old barn for the last 25 years and just sees an old barn. But that's true for wherever you travel. Now if I go to England, I see things totally different. Or if I go to Ireland, I see things that are really meaningful to me and inspire me to write a song. Somebody else walks by that and doesn't see anything. Yes, the American images that influenced my musical world absolutely lined up with my lived experience of music here. It's represented in the friendships that I've built with the players. It's represented in the fascination and respect that I have, like, for people like Mike Compton that we just talked about. It's represented in, being friends with people like Sierra Hull and Billy Strings, and seeing how much respect they have for that music and how they're carrying it forward. It totally aligns. I mean, acoustic musicians are a special breed. This is an archaic and yet noble thing that we're doing to play these instruments, because we could do stuff that's a ton more flashy than picking up a mandolin or a fiddle or an acoustic guitar. But there is just something about that old thing with, strings reverberating against wood, and the fact that you can get together with people and sit in a room, and it's you put together a little string band and it sounds incredible in the room. The instruments mix themselves. The hardest thing when you record is to recreate that intimacy and that naturalness of tone. And I just love how that comes together, in that world, and how the people relate to each other, the friendships it's creating. Like the respect that people like Billy have for Tony and for Norman Blake and for all those people that in Billy's case, especially for Doc. That's something remarkable to see, in in generation after generation that understands the importance of those figures, you know. Where else do we see that in the world? You know, maybe in sports, but I don't know. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and sports has got to a point where so much of it is driven by money that people are playing for a team for reasons other than you would choose to make music. So, you know, there's a lot of analogies that hold up. There's something about, and I think this is what we love about acoustic music, is if you want to, the whole point of art of any kind really is to communicate something from you to somebody else in some form. And acoustic music, you know, you want tone, you've got to create it. You want volume, you've got to create it. You want any kind of effect, you've got to create it. And there's nowhere to hide with any of it. And so when it's, for me, as like a listener, and when you see people do it, like you can, you know, you watch somebody. I went to see Daniel Kimbrough play in a little club over here a while ago, and he accompanied himself on a couple of songs just with a double bass. And you see how physical a thing that is to do.
Oh my God.
You know, you don't just press on a couple of pedals and hit a note and it sustains for 3 weeks. You're dragging this out of the instrument and fighting with it, and you sort of see it. And I think it's that back and forth that people really, really love with acoustic music.
Well, Daniel is an incredible player, a wonderful guy too. And the interesting thing is, you know, like, because you just said you have to fight this thing to get it out. The moment you start fighting, you know that you're going to lose. You can't fight the guitar. It's going to win. You know, you can't muscle that thing down. You can only master the guitar through gentleness, you know, not through power. Certainly the acoustic guitar, you know. Even you talked about creating volume. That's you can hit an acoustic guitar only so hard. At some point, it's just going to go like, no, I'm not going to give you any more volume. As a matter of fact, now it sounds much worse than before. Be more gentle.
Yeah, and you can see that. And you can hear it. And what you were saying about Billy, it's, you know, it takes us back to that idea of the task is to give birth to the old in a new time, because like something that is old is also equally new to somebody who's just discovered it. And that's equally valid.
That's a Carl Jung quote. You know, the task is to bring new life to something old. And I quote that in the book, because that's really what we do with music, in acoustic music, you know. And you can even, if you want to talk about the inner and outer more, or find another aspect where that's represented, it's the love for old instruments. You know, take an old instrument and play something new on it. The fascination that the people in the bluegrass world, especially with guitars, have for those instruments, or with mandolins and banjos too. But it's amazing, you know. Amazing to see people dedicating their lives to music. I mean, it's so inspiring, you know. Like I talked, the main guitar on this record is a guitar that my friend Rufus Thames in Bristol, Tennessee built. It's a dreadnought with a slotted headstock, 12-fret neck, and sloped shoulders. And I mean, the knowledge that this guy has amassed in 58, 59 years of living about guitars and making guitars, and it's just awesome. It's so beautiful, because, like, you know, there's no money in that for the first 20, 30 years that you're doing that. And you still do it, you know?
And that's kind of the overriding impression that this album has left with me so far early in my journey with this record. But just that sense of caring about craft and thinking about the past and thinking about the future and kind of shaping things and creating things and being alive to all of that. And it's been an extraordinary lesson. And I think it's really important to impress upon people that all of this stuff we've just talked about, like, you can just stick your headphones on and listen, and this is it's a beautiful record regardless. But all of digging into all of this stuff just made me appreciate it even more. And yeah, I've been fascinated by the whole thing, and it's been an absolute joy talking to you about it.
Thank you. Fun talking to somebody who gets it.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas.